I spoke to Jeremy Corbyn last weekend and he said that if no deal has been agreed, then the Prime Minister must obey the law, he must send the letter to the EU and request that extension. Well, that's happened. Are you happy?
Not really, because he's also sent another letter, hasn't he, which seems to be... well, actually, I think he may well be in contempt of Parliament or the courts themselves, because he's clearly trying to undermine the first letter and not signing the letter. He's behaving a bit like a spoilt brat. Parliament made a decision, he should abide by it. And this idea that you send another letter contradicting the first, I think it flies in the face of what both Parliament and the courts have decided.
But isn't all that stuff just theatre? You know, whether or not he signed it, whether or not he sent other things. Yes. I mean, he has sent the letter, hasn't he? And the EU seem to have accepted it.
Do you know, to a certain extent, it is theatre, but at the same time, it does drive at the heart of our democracy, where a Prime Minister has to abide by the law. And if you're, as a Prime Minister, trying to undermine a decision made by Parliament, that flies in the face of actually that concept of abiding by the law. So, yes, it is a bit of theatre, but at the same time, there is something fundamental here as well.
So you think it could go as far as going to the courts?
It may well be. Others will decide that matter. But a number of lawyers have already commented that this is seeking to undermine a decision of Parliament and therefore flies, as I say, flies in the face of both Parliament and court decisions.
What some of our viewers were thinking was they were thought that, you know, the Prime Minister only had to ask for an extension if there wasn't a deal, if he'd failed to get a deal. Yeah. Well, there is now a deal, and MPs effectively decided not to vote on it.
No,
so why are we...
what MPs did on Saturday, and remember, this has all been set up for dramatic effect and political effect by the Prime Minister, these deadlines, unnecessary deadlines. All Parliament agreed on Saturday was, before we make a decision, can we just see the legislative proposals in detail, like any other piece of legislation, like any other law we're considering? Let us have the bill and let's consider that bill properly. Now, that's not too much to ask for when you're talking about legislation that will affect the future of our economy for the next generation.
It's not just the Prime Minister setting the deadlines, is it? The October 31st deadline was the one that was agreed by the European Union, and the deadline of the 19th was the one that was agreed by MPs.
Well,
he's just trying to follow the deadlines set by
others. Respect, the 19th was the proposal by the Prime Minister himself, and this idea of Super Saturday, as far as I can see, was simply for theatrical effect. What we said to him on Saturday, yesterday, was, look, we need the bill before us, like we would consider any other bill, even minor amendments to the law we consider through legislation in that way. We're saying bring it back next week and let's consider it. And, you know, he might even meet the deadline of the 31st of October if we go through a proper parliamentary process.
So is there any chance that Labour will back the deal next week then?
We will, when the bill comes forward, what we'll try to do, as in the normal way, put amendments to that bill and see whether or not we can ensure that it meets the criteria that we've set out. The problem that we've got is this is becoming quite a fundamental choice about the future of our economy. Do we want to go down the Boris Johnson proposals of diverging from our major trading partner and deregulating our economy, undermining workers' rights, consumer and environmental rights? No, we don't. So what we'll try and do is, of course, try and amend that legislation and see if we can get agreement in Parliament.
You say that it undermines workers' rights, but there's nothing that actually mentions workers' rights, you know, in the actual agreement, is there? The only way that, as you say, workers' rights could be undermined is if that's voted for by Parliament, which is how a democracy works.
Well, what's interesting is that we have guarantees. We had guarantees under Theresa May that actually this level playing field that we want between us and Europe on workers' rights, consumer and environmental rights, would be contained within the international treaty, the bill itself. And what we got from Boris Johnson was taking it out of the treaty and therefore removing those protections that we had. And this is a matter of trust. Can we trust Boris Johnson with employment, consumer and environmental rights? Well, he's just betrayed this is a Conservative and Unionist Prime Minister who's just betrayed his partners, the DUP. Of course we can't trust him.
I mean, what they would say is that they've managed to get a veto or a unilateral exit mechanism for Northern Ireland, which is something that the EU would never say they would. They've managed to protect the fact that they won't have a hard border on the island of Ireland.
Far from me to speak on behalf of the DUP, but I listened to what they said yesterday. They were promised by Boris Johnson, in his own words, no border down the Irish Sea. That's happening. They were promised that he would abide by the processes of the Good Friday Agreement. The process he's put forward undermines the Good Friday Agreement in that way. This is the DUP talking, not me. He's betrayed his own electoral partners. How can we trust him on anything?
What would you do to Labour MPs who defy what the leadership says and support the deal?
Well, the whips will deal with them in the normal way. I've always...
What is the normal way? What's that mean?
Well, the normal way is conversation, a discussion, and then they'll take appropriate action. Thank goodness I'm not the chief whip. I've got enough on my plate as shadow chancellor. But
it's Jeremy Corbyn's decision as well, though, isn't it?
Well, it's the chief whip reporting to the leader. I've always said there has to be a respectful whip on a number of these things where we take into account people's views, and that's what we've done so far. Yesterday, I think what was interesting was people are honestly expressing their views, and they will over the process of this legislation. And that's the best way forward. And I say that across all parties as well.
So would you call on MPs on your own side, Labour supporters, to back off some of the criticism that we've seen levelled at people such as Caroline Flint, such as Melanie on?
People have to be listened to. Melanie and Caroline have made detailed criticisms of the proposals themselves, and they've also put forward their own ideas about how it can be improved. People have to be listened to. And I think that applies across all political parties. Even this morning, there's a number of Conservatives who may have voted with the Prime Minister on Saturday, but are deeply concerned about the nature of this legislation. And I'll just give you one example. Philip Hammond stood up in Parliament and said he's really worried that we're still in a situation whereby the government could negotiate in a very limited time for a free trade agreement, and yet then still hang over us the prospect of a no deal after that 12 months' time, after the end of the transition period. That's a real worry for a number of Conservative MPs as well as Labour MPs.
So what do you think needs to happen next then? What's Labour's plan? Because it's very easy, isn't it, to criticise whatever the government's put forward. What's the way through?
Look, we understand the frustration of people. We're all frustrated. We want to sort this thing out. We've got the legislation. We're saying to the government, it's pointless bringing another meaningful vote. That's just a political stunt. And I'm not even sure if the...
How can you say it's pointless? Isn't it really important to have a vote on the deal that's been struck by the EU? And
we have a vote on the deal when you see the legislation. Until you see the legislation, you don't know the detail. And as someone said yesterday in the debate, the devil is in the detail. All we've got at the moment is some of the elements of the agreement. We haven't got that translated into detailed legislation. That's how we enact legislation. That's how we make laws in this country. You don't do it on the basis of a few pages of writing, that script that were put before you.
What needs to happen?
Right, OK. What I'm saying to the government is, pointless bringing the meaningful vote again. We've had one debate on that. I'm not even sure if the Speaker will allow it. Bring the legislation forward and let's do the real parliamentary process of scrutinising that legislation. And yes, we'll be moving amendments and see whether or not we can get some form of agreement through the House of Commons that's then acceptable.
Are you going to be moving an amendment for a second referendum?
Well, that will almost inevitably come up. There was an amendment tabled on Saturday. We've always said, actually, that the people decide.
So will Labour move it, though? I mean, it's different, isn't it, it will inevitably come up.
Well, often,
if the opposition moves it.
Yeah, often the tactical choice on this is sometimes it's better coming from a group of MPs from the backbenches where you can get cross-party agreement. And we backed, can you remember, we've spoken about this on your programme some months ago, we backed the Kyle Wilson amendment, which came from the backbenches with some cross-party support. Now, I think inevitably that will come up, but we've always said, on a deal like this, if Boris Johnson is confident about this deal, go back to the people with it.
You see, the fact that you say that it will inevitably come up, but it doesn't sound like Labour will put it forward. You can't help but wonder. You can't help but wonder. You were there on the People's Vote March yesterday, but so far Labour has effectively chickened out of bringing forward a push for a second referendum. When I spoke to Jeremy Corbyn last weekend, he said he couldn't even tell me how he would campaign if there was a second referendum, leave or remain. I mean, are you at risk here of not seeming as if you're a party wholly behind a second referendum, that you're falling through the cracks on Brexit?
No, not at all. We voted for the Kyle Wilson amendment before, which called for a second referendum. It was raised again on Saturday, but not moved. I'm sure it will be moved. Tactically, these things are often better moved from the backbenches where you can secure cross-party support and where you're not alienating people purely and simply because it's the leader of the opposition moving it. What we've said is Boris Johnson should take this deal back to the people. We've also said, we want a general election too. And in that general election, we've said we would negotiate a sensible option for Brexit, and then we'd put that before the people. So we're not averse to going back to the people, quite the reverse. We want the people to have the final say. You've
been relatively quick to move behind the idea of a second referendum. Jeremy Corbyn perhaps has taken a little bit longer to get to that point. I just wanted to have a look at a quote, a video, if you like, that was circulating on social media from 2013. It's you and Jeremy Corbyn. You're at a fringe event, a Labour Representation Committee fringe event, which is a socialist group in Labour. And this is something that Jeremy Corbyn said at that time. He said to you, "It's quite helpful to have you around to explain why I'm supporting something when it isn't obvious to me as to why we should be, but I'm sure there's a good reason behind it and you do it so well." Is that what's happened with the second referendum? Have you been around helpfully explaining to Jeremy Corbyn why he needs to...
I remember he was pulling my leg. It was a joke.
I mean, you can see that there is tongue-in-cheek, but is there a little bit of truth
No,
there?
not at all. I think what happened was... I think, if I remember rightly on this, I'd interrupted him whilst he was speaking about something, and he was joking that way. But, you know, we work together. We're a close partnership. We've worked together for 40 years. And sometimes we'll agree, sometimes we'll disagree, but we'll always support one another, and that's what we always do. And when he thinks I'm going off the rails, he'll tell me.
Does he think you go off the rails on Brexit a little bit?
No, not at all, no. We've followed consistently Labour Party policy from the conference before last, and we've gone through that sequence of events, and that's where we are.
I mean, there have been reports that there's been a bit of a power struggle within the Labour Party.
Oh, this always comes up.
On policy issues, on the second referendum, on staffing issues, and that you are the winner, you're the one taking back control.
Yeah. This comes up every autumn. It's like a hardy perennial. Usually, in 1 week last year, I think it was, I was organising a coup, and then within the same week, I was holding Jeremy Corbyn hostage, forcing him not to resign. This is farcical. We work together. We'll never be divided. We always back each other up. We'll have disagreements on different matters, but we'll always come to a conclusion that we support each other.
OK. What do you think should come first? A second referendum or a general election?
Well, if we're dealing with this bill, what we're saying to Boris Johnson, you should put it to the people. But what we're saying is it would be better to have a general election. We think we would argue for a general election in which we could put forward our proposals to negotiate a sensible deal, Brexit deal, but would have a Remain option as well, and then we'd go back to the people. We can do that in a limited period of time as well and get this matter over with once and for all.
So, you know, as the Letwin Amendment has gone through, as the letter has been sent, no deal does appear to be off the table, at least for the moment. Does that mean that if the government brought forward a motion to try and trigger a general election, would Labour back it? Well,
we want to be absolutely sure no deal is off the agenda, and we're not sure of that yet. Let's see the legislation. Let's see what we can do with this legislation and how far we can move amendments and secure our economy. Look, people think this is all about parliamentary process. This isn't. What this is about is a fundamental choice about the future of our country. Do we want to go down with an economy in which Boris Johnson wants us to diverge from our major market and deregulate our economy? What does deregulation...
Only if that gets through Parliament.
Well, let's read what deregulation means. This is how important it is for us. It means undermining workers' rights, going along the American economic model, you know, 8 to 10 days annual leave, individual contracts,
that would
undermining,
have to be signed off
undermining basic trade union rights where we have the protections now. We can't trust Boris Johnson with our economy in that way, but also it means undermine our consumer protections and, yes, I think undermine our environmental protections. That's what this battle is all about. It isn't some romantic view of Europe or anything like that. This is about the future of our economy and the living standards of our people.
Just quickly, you were talking there about an election. You say you want an election. If Labour loses that election, should Jeremy Corbyn stand down?
Well, that'll be a decision for Jeremy. I've said in the past, you know, usually when you leave an election, you stand down and all the rest of it. That'll be a decision for Jeremy. I think there's no prospect of us losing that election. I think
going back a little bit from what you said in an interview.
That's all.
You said the usual thing would be...
Yes, that's right. But I also said, which wasn't included in the clips or the reports, that we're going to win that election. We'll have a majority Labour government, which will enable us to build upon that, well, our ideas about how we want to transform our society, and we will.
When do you want the election to be?
Well, as soon as we possibly can.
Before Christmas?
Well, we'll see. We'll see what happens over this next week or so. I'd like to get rid of this government as soon as possible so that we can start rebuilding our country.